and the privilege and the joy to welcome you here tonight. This is going to be a wonderful reading. I'm Carol Minkiti, and my husband was Ifani Minkiti, and he loved this place. In fact, he thought it was a very sacred place. So welcome, and I know it's a wonderful reading tonight. So enjoy yourselves.
We'll enjoy ourselves, we will. Hi, my name is Fred Marchant, and I'm going to introduce this evening. Welcome, first of all, and thank you all for coming out on this otherwise dreary, cold night. Thank you to the Minkiti family and to Carol in particular, and thank you, James, who keeps the pulse going. And so, thank you. I'm going to introduce all three poets in a way. This is not, however, an ordinary introduction. One point of contact and connection among these three poets, or poets and poet translators, is that each has had a life in which war has made its scorching presence felt, the violence and the social consequences of that violence. Nguyen Ba Chung was born in 1949 to a farming family east of Hanoi. It was a family that left the north for the south of Vietnam around the time of the division of the country into communist and non-communist, or ostensibly democratic. Later, when the Cold War became the American War in Vietnam, Tung was abroad, studying in Switzerland and then at Brandeis, studying American literature at Brandeis. However, when the war resolved itself, he was a man in exile in this country. His life's journey, and particularly his bilinguality, brought him circa 1985 to the William Joyner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences at UMass Boston. Himself a poet, an essayist, an everyday translator, that is to say, the practical matters of life kind of translator, he was also a literary translator, and Chung became the primary cultural liaison with present-day Vietnam and the Joyner Center and its effort at cross-cultural relations. This was at a time when there was no diplomatic recognition between these countries. It was worse. It was the aftermath, the ending of starvation level blockade of trade goods in Vietnam, imposed by this country. With Kevin Bowen, the director then of the Joyner Center, himself a poet and translator, the whole idea of cultural exchange, visits, translation, veterans going back, performances, all of that became central to the Joyner Center's mission. And for the next 30 years, it was especially so every 2 weeks at the end of June, when there was a writers' conference sponsored by the Joyner Center. Martha Collins well, I should say something first of all. Both of these people are my dearest of friends, and we worked together all of those 30 years. I should have snuck that in at the end of that paragraph. It wasn't as if Tung and Kevin were the only persons at the Joyner Center who were deeply committed to these kinds of cultural exchanges. I remember my first visit to the Joyner workshops in 1994. I was amazed and thrilled to realize that here were 4 writers from Vietnam. They are real writers in person, having their work translated or co-translated with Chung's help and the help of the poets who were there. It was a norm. It became a norm in the Joyner Center for everyone to get involved in some way or another in this kind of co-translation project. I'm not exactly sure when Martha Collins first began her workshops in translation, but there may be someone in this room who actually experienced them, who encountered the most extraordinary engagement with poetry that I've ever seen in a workshop. I used to walk around after the session saying, this was an examination of the nature of this art. Now, 30 years later, I realized it was more than that. It was also an examination of the nature of cultural expression, the idiosyncratic individuality that each writer brings to a piece of art. Martha's translation workshops became a beacon for anyone interested in translation, not just from the Vietnamese, but any language. Martha herself, of course, was the founder of the creative writing program at UMass Boston in the English department, and she was then publishing her own extraordinary poetry, her first book coming in 1985. Her work that followed in one way or another never failed to register the war or the wars we were living through. Those wars had many different names. Let us say some might be racism, others might be sexism, domestic violence, exploitative capitalism. Like Denise Levertov, Martha Collins made and continues to make discoveries, revelations about the connections among these predations. And as Levertov said in her poem, Life at War, the same war continues in so many different ways. 12 books of poetry, various essays, reviews, teachings, and 5 books of co-translation, working with Vietnamese poets, including to Martha Collins continues to help clarify and name the strife that we encounter in our lives right now. Tuê Sy was born in 1943. And early on in life, he entered an order of Buddhist monks in and around Nha Trang, a city north of Saigon. He graduated from Van Han University in Saigon in 1965 and became later a tenured professor as a young man. It's worth noting in 1965, that's when the first Marine Corps detachments arrived in Hue, in south of Hue, and the real American war, or the American aspect of the war, began. Tuê Sy teaching in his Buddhist university was, in a way, placing himself beyond partisan and political strife. In some way, I sense anyway, I'm going to make, a sort of projection. One senses in his life story an absolute conviction that religious thought and practice had of necessity to be free of and separate from the violence of war and those who participate in it. To my own Western and perhaps, maybe it's even Anglo-Saxon and Protestant even, way of thinking, he was similar to a conscientious objector. He took himself out of the war itself and proceeded to work with as a Buddhist practitioner. And I often, as reading these poems, I often thought I could feel inside it the metta, the loving kindness prayer that may all beings be safe. The official end of the war and the unification of the country, however, did not end the war. As Denise Levertov said, the same war continued. He was arrested, as you'll learn, in 1978, and then again in 1984. And then in 1988, imprisoned with a death sentence that was later commuted to 20 years, and after international pressure, was sliced down to 10 years. His crime was in advocacy for the independence of religious practice and structures inside the society. And in those years, in the immediate aftermath of the war, especially the American war, especially, that was utterly subversive to those who ran the party, capital P party in Hanoi. I'll stop here, where our readers have so much to say and write and speak about in Tuê Sy's work. But I want to end by saying something about the title of this book and the poem that it comes from. The mountain that is dreamt of in Tuê Sy's work is that place where the soul can breathe. It's an idea of freedom, perhaps, an idea of what the soul, perhaps, of this country and culture, Vietnam, had always been and what he hoped could be. It's an idea, too, of a place beyond the war, beyond human beings taking each other's lives. Tuê Sy passed away on November 27th last and was able to see the proofs of this book before he died. Nguyen Ba Chung and Martha Collins represent the long 30-year work of the Joyner Center in making a cultural exchange real, palpable, and, as one might say, bringing these poems into English. Our friends, Martha Collins and Nguyen Ba Chung.
If everyone could please take a minute to silence your cell phones as well, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think we agreed to sit down, but I'm not sure I can be seen. I guess what people. So thank you, Fred. Thank you, James. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, the Grolier, and thank you all for being here. I'm grateful to Fred for that rather complete bio of Thoi Xa. I want to add just one little sentence from an obituary that appeared after his passing in November, which noted that his passing was a significant loss to all who stand for religious freedom and human rights. These things that are so important in our world, all over our world today. So I want to begin with a very brief story about what happened to me almost 12 years ago. I got an email from Nguyen Ba Chung, my friend, and he said, "Can you help me with translations of these 3 poems?" And I said, "Oh, sure." We had worked together in that translation workshop that Fred mentioned. We translated a few things together. And so we went back and forth with the poems and they were done. And I said, "So, Jim, what are you going to do with these poems?" And he said, "Oh, we're translating a book of them." And I said, "We?" So almost 12 years later, we have that book. And I would like to begin by asking Chung to say a little bit about why he thought it would be so important to translate the poems of Tuê Sy.
Growing up in Vietnam and witnessing the war, I was deeply influenced by the poetry and the life of this monk. Because in Vietnam, although the Communist Party succeeded in unifying the country, there's one thing that I don't agree with, and that is that it wants to maintain control of the religious organization in the country to the extent that the unified Buddhist church that exists before 1975 and actually helped in the overthrow of President Nguyen Zen was not allowed to function. And so the government succeeded in creating a government-sponsored Buddhist church and left the unified religious out of it. It's no longer a legal entity from the government's perspective. So I was deeply disturbed by that. And I read a lot of his poetry and was deeply moved by it. So that's always one thing that I like to do, is to be able to translate it, to make it available in English. But one other thing about his poetry, it's very difficult to translate, more difficult than many others. So that's the thing that make me hesitate before I made the proposal to Martha.
But Chung did not tell me that it was difficult until sometime later when we were deeply involved in this process. He didn't tell me that he didn't know whether we could do it. So I'm glad you didn't, because I might not have signed on. We're going to read a number of poems. Usually I will read the English. And by the way, can everyone hear both of us? Okay. I'm usually going to read the English first, and then Chung will read the Vietnamese. But we're going to begin with the first poem in the book, which is also the first poem that we translated. And just so you can hear Vietnamese, I'm going to ask Chung to read the poem first in Vietnamese. It's called in English, A Piece of Old Sky. This is an early poem written before the end of the war, while Tuê Sy was still in what was then Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City.
Khung trời cũ, đôi mắt ướt tuổi vàng, khung trời hồi cũ, áo màu xanh không xanh mãi trên đồi hoang. Phút vội vã không thấy mình du thủ, thắp đèn khuya ngồi kể chuyện trăng tàn. Từ núi lạnh đến biển im muôn thuở, đỉnh đá này và hạt muối đó chưa tan. Cười với nắng một ngày sao chóng thế, nay mùa đông mai mùa hạ buồn chăng. Đếm tóc bạc tuổi đời chưa đủ, bụi đường dài gọi mối đi quanh. Giờ ngó lại bốn vách tường ủ rũ, suối rừng xa ngược nước xuôi ngàn.
I fell in love with the sounds of Vietnamese poetry from the very beginning. And you can hear, I think, Vietnamese has 6 tones. So Chinese has 4, Vietnamese has 6. And the sound of those tones makes a pattern in these poems, which is quite wonderful. So here is the poem in English. A Piece of Old Sky. Damp young eyes, sky over old gatherings. A deserted hill, a blue dress no longer blue. Rushing, I see myself as a vagabond, telling stories by lamplight, a fading moon. From cold mountain to sea, forever silent, the stony crest, those salt grains haven't dissolved. Smile in the sunlight, how quickly a day passes. Today, winter, tomorrow, summer, how sad. I count my silver hairs, but I'm not old. Tired feet walk back and forth on the dusty road. Looking back, I see 4 sullen walls. A distant stream runs up and down through the forest. Maybe thinking about that poem or otherwise, Chung, could you just say a few words about what makes these poems difficult and unique?
Another thing I noticed is that Tuê Sy poem in each sentence had so many images in it. For example, the first line of the poem I just read, đôi mắt ướt tuổi vàng khung trời hồi cũ. Đôi mắt ướt is deep damp young eyes. Tuổi vàng, golden age. We do not translate that because there's no space for it. And then khung trời hội cũ, the sky over all gatherings. There is a word hội cũ. Hội means a festival. You don't see the word festival in the translation. So in order to get the sense of the line, we basically have to decide which is the most important image and use it. Otherwise, you would not have a poetry line, but a whole prose line. So that is one of the very difficult things that Tuê Sy did with his poetry. Secondly, because he's a monk and he's deeply involved in Zen. And Zen is something that is very difficult to pin down sometimes. It's say about something that could mean nothing or mean nothing, and yet it says a lot. And so how do you capture what is being meant in these lines? You can guess at its meaning, but any of the guess could be wrong. So that's the most difficult thing about Tuê Sy's poem, is the fact that it's deeply of a Zen nature.
And I would just add that we are so used to connective tissue in our poems. And these images just simply follow one another. And the task of the reader and the listener, you all now, is to just go from one to another and have it all add up in the end. But the resistance to making connections is one of the things that I really had to work on.
Another part is even deeper than that. That is the difficult between English and Vietnamese, and the cultural difference between the two countries. The line that I just quote from Tuê Sy's poem sounds perfectly normal in Vietnamese. The Vietnamese allow you to make a series of images without any problem, but English doesn't allow you to do that. So the Vietnamese allow you to go from one line to another without any connective. In English, you don't seem able to do that. No. One line move to the next, there must be something that connecting them. In Vietnamese, the connection is provided by the reader. And the reader could provide any kind of connection that's possible in those circumstances. So every poem has a different meaning for the reader. And that's why that to translate to English, you have to choose one meaning. And that's another very difficult part of translating Vietnamese into English.
But we tried to get as many meanings as possible. And I found really quite wonderful the fact, and in some ways made the translation kind of easier, because sometimes the line tends to be sort of self-contained. And I avoided often trying to make those connections and just let the images pile up. And so I hope that you can hear that as we go ahead and read. The next poem is also an early poem, and then we'll move on to some later ones. This is called Rainy Season in the Highlands. And you can see, I'll sort of indicate the lines, and you can see how each line is sort of self-contained. A swallow, a hazardous stretch of road, a tall waterfall heard through a long night, stepping quickly across a vanished river, waiting for rain in the flutter of butterflies. A ghost calls your name each morning, day by day, sound by pointless sound. Rain greens black hair, heavy with dew. In dreams, leaves drift far away from shore. For a long time, you stand in the sunlit river, telling tales of what far places and times. A small butterfly travels on fragile wings. But where can a leaf go away from its season? Months and years are like smiles in dreams. You keep going on as water runs from its source. Strange shores tell their secrets to the shadows. Stray clouds 1,000 years ago, old hair.
Mưa cao nguyên, một con én, một đoạn đường lây lất, một đêm dài nghe thác đổ trên cao. Ta bước vội qua dòng sông biển biệt, đợi mưa rầm trong cánh bướm xôn xao. Bóng ma gọi tên người mỗi sáng, từng ngày qua, từng tiếng vu vơ. Mưa xanh lên tóc huyền sương nặng, trong giấc mơ lá rạc xa bờ. Người đứng mãi giữa lòng sông nhuộm nắng, kể chuyện gì nửa ngày cũ xa xưa. Con bướm nhỏ đi về trong cánh mỏng, nhưng về đâu một chiếc lá xa mùa. Năm tháng vẫn như nụ cười trong mộng, người mãi đi như nước chảy xa nguồn. Bờ bến lạ chút tự tình với bóng, mây lạc loài ôi tóc cũ ngàn năm.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the poems, some poems that were written between 1975 and 1977. As Fred indicated, as the war ended, first the Americans withdrawing in 1973, and then the war ending in 1975, Tuê Sy left Saigon worried about the cracking down on the Buddhists, and went first to a hill and then into a forest hut. Fred mentioned the significance of the mountain in the title, and maybe before we read, or maybe I'll just read a couple in English, Chung could say just a word about that particular mountain.
As you know, Trường Sơn is the long mountain that runs from South Vietnam all the way, run from North Vietnam all the way to South Vietnam. And during the war, it was the main route that the North used to supply the South by creating roads through the forest to carry tons of weapons and other war materials to the South. And it's one of the places that the US did everything it could, including bombing thousands and thousands of times this road. But Tuê Sy, he was actually born in Laos, in Pak Se, which is somewhat near the Trường Sơn Mountain. So to him, Trường Sơn Mountain represents the country itself. And the reason that he named the collection of poems Giấc mơ Trường Sơn was because in 1975, when Northern troops entered into Nha Trang, where he was staying at the Buddhist Institute, up in the hill, and he could hear the march of the troop down below. And he realized deeply at that moment that his life could have been changed, because realized in the North, Buddhism was not allowed to function freely. It was suppressed in the North. Most of the senior monks, the government concluded that they did not participate in any productive task for the country. So they are asked to leave the pagoda and only allow old women and people that the government trained to become monks. So he realized that now with the coming of the troops, that his life could be changed completely. And he was dreaming of a peak in the Trường Sơn Mountain that has been buffeted by so many hurricanes, so many windstorms, and his life would begin a completely new stage. And that's why he called it the dream of Trường Sơn. It represents to him the genuine fate, destiny of Vietnam.
This is the cover of the book actually has a drawing that is based on a photograph of a mountain in the Trường Sơn. So this is a poem. I think I'll just read this one in English. that is a kind of summary of his life, but is written in 1975 after the end of the war. It's called The Years Away. The wind gave you 10 long years of wandering, seeing your country only in its ruin. The eastern sea still whispers to white sand, tales of compassion, breath of the Joan sun. 10 more years you were silent in the city. Love for the forest brought you close to tears. Arms reached for the sky, the birds late chirping. Life adrift, small wings closing up by the road. 10 years later, you crossed streams and forests, saw your country as bloody abandoned fields. Evening smoke fades like wounded souls. Each river, each stream of blood and tears overflows. For 10 years, you forgot your reed-thin weakness. On slender shoulders, a new country rose. You bent your head to hear mountain and forest, chanting the endless love song of the East. The day you came back to the ancient city, roads were still shadowed with sorrow's smoke. Eyes still shone with timeless indignation, as fresh as rain in the borderlands, as true. And then I think I'll read, why don't I read A Slender Moon and then you can read the Vietnamese for that, okay? This is another one from the same time period. A Slender Moon. Resting, I embrace a slender mood. Disgraced bows shoulders, rancor shakes fading dreams. Many deep forests run through the Jung sun. Many red clouds from tides of the eastern sea. On an ill-fated journey, tears will spill over. Can one who journeys keep a simple heart? His blood mingles red with the flag's color. The sky cuts his remarkable dream in half. An army march tramples the setting sun. Lips are mortified by the traveler's song. Love, when true, takes no revenge on others. One can seclude oneself in a wandering life.
Một bóng chăn gầy. Nằm ôm một bóng chăn gầy, vai nghiêng tủi nhục, hờn lay mộng tàn. Rừng sâu mấy nhịp Trường Sơn, biển đông mấy độ, chiều dâng ráng hồng. Khóc tràn cuộc lữ long đong, người đi còn một tấm lòng đơn sơ. Máu người pha đỏ sắc cờ, phương trời xẻ nửa giấc mơ dị thường. Quân hành đạp nát tà dương, khúc ca du tử bẻ bàng trên môi. Tình chung không trả thù người, khuất thân cho trọn một đời luân lưu.
And one more very short one from this period, and I think Jim will comment a little bit about this one. This is called Reflection. I can still hear the cicadas' song, can still love the night fire's flames. Home is just a peak in the Jung sun. Let's proclaim our 1,000-year indignation.
A 1,000 years indignation. It's the history of Buddhism in Vietnam, supposedly over 2,000 years. And that's where the line came from. Tự tình, còn nghe được tiếng ve sầu, còn yêu đốm lửa, êm sâu bập bùng. Quê người trên đỉnh Trường Sơn, cho ta gửi một nỗi hờn yên thu.
And another short one, these are quatrains. And maybe Jim will want to comment on this after he reads it in English as well. Fleeting dream. Emerald eyes on a great festival day. That smile fades the sunset's afterglow. Like a white stork against a deep green field. I love because the world is a moment's dream.
Một thoáng chiêm bao. Người mắt biếc ngây thơ ngày hội lớn. Khóe môi cười nắng quái cũng gầy hao. Như cỏ trắng giữa đồng xanh bất tận. Ta yêu người vì khoảng khắc chiêm bao. The thing that being discussed about this poem is it's a poem about love. And of course, with the monk, what does he mean by love? Does it mean that the love of a beautiful girl somewhere? Actually, in Tuê Sy's intention, especially the line, I love because the world is a moment's dream. That is a kind of Zen saying. Because the whole world is a dream. Therefore, I love. But also knowing in my love that it's only a momentary dream. It will not last. And that is the essence of Zen, is nothing would last. Everything is impermanent. And one of the things that one can get over falling in love and forever falling in love is to realize that.
I have come to appreciate Zen a great deal more through these poems. And I have to say, Jim has been a great teacher to me. We're going to turn now to a poem that that Tuê Sy wrote while he was anticipating his first stint in prison. Prison for him at first, the first time, was for 2 years in a re-education camp, which was essentially a prison. So this is while he was anticipating that. I still wait. I still wait through long, restless nights. Pale green cries sound from the forest edge. In hatred's darkness, there is still love. A star brims like tears beside my lips. I still wait through black, windless nights, the pure, shimmering black of ancients' eyes. I look deep to lengthen history's path, a river of blood and tears over the land. I still wait to forget the beating waves, the Pacific Ocean, people back and forth. Those who stayed ache in the tyrant's hands, slender reeds weighed down by the sun at dusk. Then, with a frail body, I face prison, fingers tapping time on a mossy wall. Then, my eyes closed, I go to the dream place. Like early dew, like lightning, like evening clouds.
You notice the line near the end, those who stay ache in the tyrant's hand. That's one of the reasons that this book was not allowed to be printed in Vietnam. But I was very surprised that recently I realized that it was finally being allowed to be published, not by a printing house in Saigon or Hanoi, but another province called Da Nang. And I looked, and this poem was allowed to appear in that collection. And not only that, a couple of months in 2023, some Buddhist monks and nuns was allowed to have a reading of this book. And so that shows that the government has somewhat changed, but how much more deeply that it changed, which they have to wait. Tôi vẫn đợi. Tôi vẫn đợi những đêm xanh khắc khoải, màu xanh sao trong tiếng khóc ven rừng. Trong bóng tối hận thù tha thiết mãi, một vì sao bên khóe miệng rừng rừng. Tôi vẫn đợi những đêm đen lặng gió, màu đen tuyền ánh mắt tự ngàn xưa. Nhìn hun hút cho dài thêm lịch sử, dài con sông tràn máu lệ với cha. Tôi vẫn đợi suốt đời quên sóng vỗ, quên những người xuôi ngược Thái Bình xương. Người ở lại giữa lòng tay bạo chúa, cõng lao gầy chịu nặng đánh tà xương. Rồi trước mặt ngục tù thân bé bỏng, ngón tay nào gõ nhịp xuống tường rêu. Rồi nhắm mắt ta đi vào cõi mộng, như sương mai, như ánh chớp mây chiều. The last two lines. Then my eye closed, I go to the dream place. Like early dew, like lightning, like evening clouds, is a direct quote from the Buddhist Sutra. Very famous line that it means that everything is impermanent, like dew, like lightning, like evening clouds.
Now I'll read first in English and Chung can read the Vietnamese. Two poems from a sequence of quatrains that Tuê Sy actually wrote in classical Chinese. And I think one of the first one was translated, both of these were translated by Chung into Vietnamese, and then we translated them into English. The first of these two quatrains, I believe, is quite famous, right? So both of these are from Sleep Talking in Prison. These were written while he was in re-education camp. Dedication. Two hands lift the prison bowl of rice to dedicate it to the Lord of all. World overflowing with blood and strife. Bowl raised as wordless tears fall. I'll read the other one and then you can read both. Narrow cage. I live in a narrow cage, but I am content. Light-hearted, free, I walk back and forth. I laugh and talk, listening to myself. A long prison day passes as if it were nothing.
The first poem is an amazing description of his reaction, why imprisoned for 14 years. Within that 14 years, he's not allowed to meet anybody from the outside. He lives in a very small place and not allowed to write or to do anything. And these are the things that he remembered right back after he was released. First poem is about his dedication of his prison's rice. He has nothing to offer to the Buddha. So he offered the rice that was given to him every meal. And he said, "Oh, raise as worthless tears fall." woodless here, just quiet here when he think of the suffering of the people outside. Phụng thờ ngục tù phàn, cúng dường tối thắng tôn, thế gian trường tuyệt hành, bình bát lẽ vô ngôn. And the second poem is on narrow cage, that is a very small place where he is imprisoned. And it describes his attitude when he was imprisoned for 14 years. No hatred, no worry. Trách lung do tự tại, tản bộ, nhược nhàn du, tiểu thoại, độc ảnh hưởng, không tiêu với nhật tù. I laugh and talk, listening to myself. A long prison day passes as if it were nothing.
Quite remarkable. We'll read 3 more poems, and the next one is anticipating his second bout in prison. There was a brief period when he was out, and it's called Descending the Mountain. Tomorrow the monk will descend the mountain, a frayed thin robe on his shoulders. Prayer beads consume the years. No incense reaches the drinkers. At dawn, the monk will descend the mountain, his white hair vexed by labor. In the east, the sun will be red. No clouds fly in summer. Tomorrow, the monk will descend the mountain, the city his last impasse. Now he coughs in the darkness. The temple grows deep and vast. At dawn, the monk will descend the mountain, tears at the rims of his eyes. Because the monk loves darkness, nightmares wait on the forest path.
Because nightmares wait on the forest path is the potential of him being caught or imprisoned. Hạ Sơn. Ngày mai sư xuống núi, áo mỏng sờn đôi vai, chuối hạt mòn 5 tháng, hương trầm lỡ cuộc say. Bình minh sư xuống núi, tóc trắng hờn xinh nhai, phương đông mặt trời đỏ, mùa hoa không mây bay. Ngày mai sư xuống núi, phố thị bước đường cùng, sư hô trong bóng tối, điện Phật trầm mông lung. Bình minh sư xuống núi, khóe mắt còn rưng rưng, vì sư yêu bóng tối, ác mộng giữa đường rừng.
Nocturne. Who cries in the long night of anger and grief? Whose lullabies brim with blood, tears, and pity? Whose soul is that, groping with thin hands? It's my soul, searching for traces of the land. Whose desolate white hair on that snowy peak? Whose unsteady steps remote in the misty veil? Like a pebble lying lonely for thousands of years. Where is my soul? Where in these mythic remains?
Dạ khúc. Tiếng ai khóc trong đêm trường uất hận. Lời ai ru trào máu lệ, y thương. Hồn ai đó, đôi tay gầy sờ soạng. Là hồn tôi tìm dấu cũ quê hương. Ai tóc trắng điều hiu trên đỉnh tuyết, bước chập chờn heo hút giữa màn sương. Viên đá cuội mấy nghìn năm cô quạnh, hồn tôi đâu trong dấu tích hoang đường.
And the last poem we'll read is called Echoed Music. I think it's a particularly appropriate poem to read as we remember Tuê Sy's passing in November. Echoed Music. I remember winter days I remember winter days brimming with wine. In that festival season, quavering sobs of demons. Sad music spread at noon on sunless streets. In nothingness, eyes reflected 1,000 seas. The music lifts the spirit into the blood. Transmigrating steps are jostled by green reeds. Yellow waves push on, but there's no pier. Floating demons, adrift, sprinkle ashes. Still the ancient music blackened with smoke, pressing time into blood wine, pure and green. Strong wine, but genius gathers sand and dust. In the fragile heart, ecstatic gratitude, love. Oh, the rhythm of geniuses or demons, shoved between high walls, my spirit staggers. In the long noon, I transmigrate without beginning. Body changed, eyes still full of stars.
The last line is sort of prophetic. He died in November the 28th or 27th. And 1 or 2 days before that, people took a video moving him around, and he was laughing, and tell jokes to his students. So it betrayed an attitude that body changes, eyes still full of stars. Tiếng nhạc vọng. Ta nhớ mãi ngày đông tràn rượu ngọt. Ngày hội mùa ma quỷ khóc chơi vơi. Chưa phố thị nhạc buồn loang nắng nhạt. Chìm hư vô đáy mắt đọng ngàn khơi. Đây khúc nhạc đưa hồn lên máu đổ. Ước luân hồi chen trúc cổng lau xanh. Xô đầy mãi, sóng vàng không biến độ. Trôi lênh đênh, ma quỷ rắc cho tàn. Vẫn khúc điệu từ ngàn xưa ám khói. Ép thời gian thành rượu máu trong xanh. Rượu không nhạt mà thiên tài thêm khát bụi. Thì ân tình ngây ngất cõi mong manh. Ôi tiết nhịp thiên tài hay quỷ mị. Rồi hồn ta lảo đảo giữa tường cao. Chưa dài lắm, ta luân hồi vô thủy. Đổi hình hài, con mắt vẫn đầy sao.
Thank you all very much. If anyone has any questions, do we have a couple of minutes? James, is that fine? Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Denise.
The word transmigration appeared at least 3 times in these translations, and I want to appreciate what is meant by transmigration.
The Buddhist work believe in rebirth and transmigration. So they believe that we do not just have one life, but after we die, depend upon our action on the previous life, we would be reborn appropriately, in other words, until the time that we finally remove all the impurity in our life, remove all the bad karma that we created in our previous life. That is called nirvana, that we would be totally free. And so transmigration or rebirth, this means that because he realized that he was reborn before, and he would be reborn again. So he's not free from it yet. So that's why the word transmission will apply to almost 99.99% of the people in this world. So.
Anyone else have a question? Somebody in the back row there.
In the translation, I have some rhymes, random rhymes, some iterations. Did they exist in the original communication?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, what I did, this was kind of my part of the work, was making something that carried something of the form from the Vietnamese into English. Some of the poems have a very, very intricate rhyme scheme that is both syllabic, of six eighths, 6/8, and rhyme, and a pattern of tones. Now, you can't do all that in English, and you can't do syllables into English. And what I ended up doing with the usual 8-syllable line was aiming for a sort of rough pentameter line. If the line had 5 syllables, I aimed for a tetrameter line. And I always tried to have at least, if there was a quatrain, to have at least one rhyme or off rhyme. We spent, I should say, a lot of back and forth time because Chung was insistent. These are not very free translations. Chung was insistent on the meaning and the words, and I was insistent on getting some kind of formal pattern. It was actually a joy to me. When I started writing poetry, I was writing in form, so it came kind of naturally. But I'm glad you're hearing that in English. In Vietnamese, it's even better. Fred?
I'd like to follow on that because I was looking, as you were talking, I was looking at the fact that you divided echoed music into stanzas.
Okay, echoed music is an example of this very intricate Vietnamese form that I just mentioned, with the syllables and the tones and so forth. And people in Vietnam are so used to this form. It has interlocking rhyme. It's crazy. I mean, you can look in the introduction to the book and see what it is, or you can look it up. But the poem tends to break into patterns of 4. And in Vietnamese, they never write these things in quatrains. But because that's what I could hear, and because there seemed to be logical breaks there, I made them. That's explained in the introduction. Yeah, James.
We have a question in the chat from
Yes.
Anna Warwick. Anna asks, the word indignation appeared a couple of times. Given the cultural differences, is the word the same in Vietnamese? Thanks.
I think we use indignation because that's the closest meaning to the Vietnamese. There's one of the problem in translation is that sometimes you cannot find the exact word in the original. You have several choices, and you have to pick up one that you believe best captures meaning.
We went back and forth a lot on these words. Indignation is a tough word to get into a sort of musical line, for one thing. And a word that was even harder is rancor. which of course is altogether negative in English and in Vietnamese is not. And I think this is kind of what I learned from you, that many of these words that seem so completely negative to us are not altogether negative in Vietnamese. And that's tough. But we worked on that. And honestly, I think if I hadn't had Chung pushing me, I might have taken more liberties with some of these words than I did. So I'm very grateful that I wasn't allowed to do that.
The word rankle in English always have a lot of negative connotation. Rankle, be sort of angry or feeling not at ease with that. But in Vietnamese, there's a word that is similar to angle, but totally positive. For example, say Vietnam as a country has been invaded by 3, 4, actually over 10 times. So there is a word in Vietnamese that describe the reaction of the people against such invasion. And that word similar to rankle, but it's perfectly positive because everybody is supposed to feel that. So that's.
This is the nature of translation. Yes.
Hi there. Thank you for reading together. It's a real pleasure to hear both in 2 languages from people who've both been working on it together. Not being familiar with Vietnamese at all, I'm curious what if there are any traditions of speech patterns and reading in Vietnamese that you sort of, does your voice enter into a certain intonation or rhythmic chant? I know there's a lot of, it's easy to make fun of in English, the sort of poetry reading styles, but I'm curious if there are traditions of that, or if just you personally have a way of reading poetry and how that might have affected the translation into English of what it feels like to read poetry and the musicality of it.
In Vietnamese, there's several ways to read the poem. Actually, the traditional way is usually it's called recital, and people would almost sing, to make it into like a musical poem, and that's how people professionally perform reading of poetry. And what I'm doing is just reading based upon the line, the meaning of the line, and so that's different. So, but that's one way of reading. And of course, in Vietnamese, because of the 6 tones and the meaning, you can up and down, depending each line.
Yeah, the music of Vietnamese is really quite wonderful. The first time I went to Vietnam, I had taken a semester of Vietnamese, and I remember in a speech saying, Vietnamese is so beautiful. When people speak Vietnamese, it's like the birds singing. I was very proud of myself. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Okay, well, thank you. Oh, Gary.
It's striking to hear you speak about the process of your work together and about the Vietnamese and where it comes from. Because when I hear the 2 of you back and forth, there's a kind of a music there as well that starts to take me in. And I'm just struck by how the music that you're speaking of in the Vietnamese comes through in the process of your work, but also in the process of your presenting it, offering it. That music, that the call and response back and forth is really quite moving, and it sort of just gathers me up as I listen through the evening. And really nice, so thank you.
Well, thank you.
That must be due to Martha's work.
It's our work. And I tell you, we went back and forth, which is why it took us 12 years to do this. And I'm really glad for your comment, Gary, because I think we've gotten, it's really become quite a joy. This is post-book to be presenting these poems together back and forth. So thanks for that. And thank you all once again.
Thank you for joining us this evening. We have some books for sale here. The co-translators will be signing books. Let's give one more round of applause.
Always just for children. And I'm but very sad at the end. It's really sweet. I guess we should get rid of return this. That's all, yeah.
I believe it was.
Now I need some water.
Yeah, I think we have this on the books.
Whatever. We may, our next performance is in my church in February, and I'll find out how long we have. We may have a little less time and people will want to ask, but I'll find out and let you know. And then we go to Houston.